Very dear audience, thank you so much for the invitation. Great pleasure to be here, pleasure to be back to the country I left in 1977, because I got tired of having the surveillance police sitting taking notes and the clicks in the telephone. Norwegians will understand what that means. Those who are from outside Norway think this is a peace nation and doesn't do such things. Think again. So, having said that, as a little introduction, let me go straight into the topic. Development is the genuine child whose father was Western imperialism, and the mother was Christian, let us say, Samaritanism. It was a tough father and a softer mother. The Christian Samaritan, after some time, took on more secular colors, and an element of welfare state came into it. But the Western imperialism, the Christianity, and the secularism, all of them followed Matthew 28:18-20, which is, if you will, the Western national anthem. Go ye all out and make all peoples my disciples. In other words, the basic idea and the basic sickness, psychopathology, that I'm addressing today, is the idea of possessing a universal development model that can be imposed upon the world softly, maybe a little bit corruption money with it, but generally not by bomb, with great promises. And the world better pay attention and better learn our tricks. The world was divided in two parts, the West and the rest. It had a kind of euphonic quality, and there are still social scientists around who are bad enough to use that dichotomy. One of them is the head of the CNN major programs. I'll not mention the name. I'll just say that this is the kind of thinking we have. Now, this is blatantly wrong, and is one of the major imperial efforts in history, but coming under soft covers, and those soft covers are often called development associations, Utviklingsforum, and similar things. So having said that, I'm then opening another perspective, and in this perspective I have 6 development models, and I'm pleading for the parallel attention to all of them. And that they all have not only the right of life, but have something to contribute. The interplay between them is fascinating. And we get a much more peaceful world if it is run by diversity and symbiosis and equity than if it is run by monoculture in the development field. If one uses monoculture by promoting one model alone, the Western liberal, you need a lot of pesticides. And some of those pesticides may be highly toxic. Because you will carry all the mistakes of that model to the rest of the world. This is happening today. I'm not saying the model doesn't have its positive sides. I'm just saying that, like all other models, it has a yin-yang nature to it. My point of departure is the word development itself. And I find, as a matter of fact, that the Germanic languages says it more clearly, although it is in the Latin languages too. Entwicklung, utveckling, utveckling, and so on. In other words, there is something, and another English word makes it more clear. The word unfolding. Something is unfolding. Now, the word development, you can think of photography. And you can see the negative there, taking shape in a bath with some bromides and silver and things of that kind. And something latent comes up in the light. So it is also in development. Development, sviluppo, desenvolvimiento, etc., etc. What is this thing unfolding? And I would say it's the code. The deep culture is the word human beings unfolding, we are used to think in terms of our genetic code. Our genetic code, our potential, and the potential is unlimited. But the point is that for that to come true, what is already in the genetic code has to be given a free play. Now, this also goes for social codes. It goes for state codes. It goes for civilizational codes. And it might be that somewhere there is a human code. A basically human code. In other words, in the field of development, we are talking about a number of codes at the micro, meso, macro, mega levels. And all of this is then twisted and thwarted by secularized, shrinking human minds. Shrinking, down to one point called economic growth. How did that happen? How could that be? Well, it was brilliant work by the economists in capturing the field. Evidently, very cleverly done. Making everybody a slave to economic growth and not to economic sharing. When I come to the Islamic code now, I'll make the point that togetherness and sharing are much more important than economic growth. So how did it happen? I think first of all it happened through secularism. Christianity was secularized, and then it became clear that Christianity didn't have a development model. It didn't have a development model because Jesus was never a politician. Muhammad was. Muhammad was running a city-state as a patriarch. And in the Medina part of the Quran, as opposed to the Mecca part of the Quran, the present Muslims will know very well what I'm talking about, you will find elements of a very deep genetic code for social development. What you find in the Gospels, in the Christian teaching, is very neat. You may then go to heaven and the kind of, let us say, projections of visions in paradise. And you will find it, first of all, not very dynamic. There seems to be a kind of static nature to it, which for me, myself, had the impact when I was about 13, 14, that I could imagine the first 1 million years in paradise, but the next million became a little bit trying. Kind of wanting some change. In other words, any good development model has contradictions in it. Because it has contradictions, meaning imperfections. It has change in it. Any good development model will also relate to other development models. When I was reading about the Christian paradise, and I found more information in the southern part of Norway than in Oslo, where I came from. I found Vennesla very rich in information about the Christian paradise. So I just want to, in a sense, pay attention to that point. The foreigners here may be introduced to it, but Vennesla is not what it was. Vennesla has secularized paradise. But having said that, I got the feeling that the Christian paradise was alone and had a kind of monopoly position. In addition to that, I found the transition to the Christian paradise somewhat sad. Yes. What happened here in life? So I was looking at Christian history and I found only one case that I found interesting. And I'll start with that. Paraguay. El Experimento Sagrado of the Jesuits. An enormous country under the Spanish crown. So big, but it didn't have any port, there was no coast. Brazil, Uruguay and Argentina had the coast. Or the Iberic colonization. So the crown saw it more or less as a lost case and gave it to the Jesuits. Jesuits tied up with the Guarani Indians. And out came something very interesting, also very tragic. which to me serves as a metaphor, as a paradigm for what we are experiencing today. The Jesuits and the Guaranese settled on one basic formula: no private property of land. Collective land property for private use. A genius formula. You have the right of private use for your family on the condition that you use it well. There is collective property and monitoring. This was done in villages with maximum 3,000 inhabitants in order to facilitate human compassion and solidarity. And the Jesuits were running it with a very mild hand. What happened was self-sufficiency agricultural, a high standard of livelihood, and no trade. It lasted 150 years, and the Spanish crown came and killed it. Killed it because it was against the purpose of colonization. It was to bring resources to the mother country and distribute some trinkets or whatever in the colonies. 50 years after that, the Spanish crown was killed. The country became independent in the year 1811. And lo and behold, they went back to that pattern. Now it was the state that administered collective ownership of land through giant haciendas and made private use possible. After a short while, Paraguay became the richest country in Latin America. #1 with no comparison. There was agricultural surplus that was exported to neighboring countries. In 1845, every child knew how to read and write. There was no public debt, and there was protection tariffs. The surplus was used to import English industrial specialists. They started industry and still had no port. In 1865, the patience of Manchester-Liverpool was breaking down. And the Minister of England in Buenos Aires was the one who organized the change. Manchester wanted to export its products. Liverpool wanted to ship them. And the fact that this country, Paraguay, had realized the Millennium Development Goals 150 years ahead of time was not exactly what they were interested in. They were interested in Manchester-Liverpool development goals. In other words, things were normal. It's called the West versus the West. And what happened then was that the minister organized La Triple Alianza. And the three coastal countries, or rather their elites, well settled in ports that would benefit as agents for Manchester-Liverpool, attacked Paraguay. They killed 5/6 of the population. One of the major genocides in human history. A higher proportion that was killed of European Jews. Mainly males. The males were practically speaking eliminated. They took 70% of the land. Las Misiones and Chaco ended up in Argentina and Mato Grosso in Brazil. And they managed what they wanted. They killed it. They killed it, the Jesuit Guarani experiment. El Experimento Sagrado. Paraguay is today the second poorest country in Latin America, sharing the bottom place in Bolivia and having a miserable existence. Instead of collective ownership and private use, there was latifundio. Private ownership and sometimes no use at all, or bad use. Use according to the feudal latifunda rules. The tariffs were abolished, everything was open for Manchester-Liverpool, and they were satisfied. Now, I say that because Christianity has contributed very little to development. the major exception. The debate, if one can call it that, from 1865 is exactly the same as today. You see exactly the same Anglo-American forces insisting no protectionism, private property, free markets, and by and large giving it down in things called livelihood for the peoples of the world. That livelihood is entirely possible, entirely feasible. The MDGs can be realized within a couple of years. I'm not going into that now. If one uses other ways of doing it than the principles underlying the story I just told. So, the Western liberal model evidently has its limitations. So let me now try to guide you through the Buddhist, Islamic, the Western liberal, the Western Marxist, the Japanese, and the Chinese models. And what do I mean by a model? Well, I will of course identify a code that is supposed to unfold. And that code will always have some religious basis. There will be an element of spirituality in it. And that means already that with the spirituality taken away from the West and reduced to the economic growth of highly non-spiritual economists whose brain have been transformed into computers at an early stage in their training. With that being the result, the Western liberal model in a re-spiritualizing world will fare down. When I say re-spiritualizing, it is not because old-time religion necessarily is coming back. But too many babies were thrown out with the dishwater. So when I say spirituality, and you will find some books, because I must confess I'm also peddling books. There's a book called Globalizing God, Religion, Spirituality and Peace that you might find interesting in that regard. The faith in something more than ourselves, more than the sum of individuals. In Buddhism, that is the network. In Islam, it is the togetherness in Allah. In Western liberalism, it doesn't exist. It's the sum of individuals. In Western Marxism, it's the realization of history. In the Japanese model, it's the realization of Japan. Not as an imperial power, but as a country in pact with the sun goddess, and for that reason with a mission. And that mission is expressed not in individual terms, but in social harmony. For China, it's very simple. It's not economic growth, it's social harmony. The social harmony means a mutual adjustment, a mutual attachment. It does not mean economic growth. It is not the sum of individual livelihoods. So having said that, even the Marxist Western model is more spiritual than the liberal model. And if you will, the epitome of the non-spirituality can be found in Wall Street and in Wall Street's collapse. When you cut off any kind of solidarity, and the only thing that matters is not your greed, it's a misunderstanding. What matters for these people is to get on the list of the Forbes 500, Fortune 500, and climb up on that list, and maybe become number one. It's an Olympic game they're engaged in, these people. They're fascinated with it. They don't even have time to spend that money. It's limited how often you can eat uranium caviar and have a bath in champagne every hour, which actually gets time. So having said that, in one sense, maybe the Western liberal model is there. And probably short selling of Lehman Brothers, because Lehman Brothers was not loyal enough. I think that's more or less what happened. And for that reason, killing it. I don't think Lehman Brothers Having said that, the financial crisis was real. And it's not a financial crisis, but a system crisis due to the asynchrony between the galloping financial economy and the stagnant real one. If you have a real one that is stagnant and the financial one is galloping, and the financial one is supposed to reflect the real one to be real, of course you get a crash. The crash came at Dow Jones 12,000 and went down to 6,000. It has now climbed up from 6,000 to 10,200 or something like that. So it's quite clear where the next crash will come. If you have dollars, get rid of them. By the way, this book is 200 Norwegian kroner or 20 euro. Dollars not accepted, don't forget. Having said that, what is the nature of the Buddhist development? Well, it is modest. It is maximization of the network. You live because you are part of a network. And that has to do with the Buddhist conception of eternal life. How can you have eternal life when there is no God, no Satan, no paradise, no hell, and you have no individual soul? Could you please put that fin to rest? Or is it me? This is the self-searching effort. I usually, when I give lectures, say to people that you can store it in a water glass. I should have pressed it up. Sorry. Now, the Buddhist conception of eternal life are the positive inspirations you give to others, and that they give on to others, and that they give on to others. And your task in life is that the sum total of those sparks radiating from any person should be possible. You don't live in another person. It's a little bit more similar to the old Nordic. Cattle die, neighbors, friends die, but one thing never dies, the memory of the dead person. But it is not the memory, it's not the monument, it's not a street name, it's not an obituary. It is you in that person, and we are all recipients of similar things. For that reason, the worst crime one could do, according to Buddhism, would be to create a society of lonely individuals. And that's what the Western liberal model, to a large extent, has done. It's called postmodernity. Postmodernity is one of the horrible prices paid for modernization, eulogized by some, I would say, relatively fine social scientists. Now, what is the Islamic idea? It's very different. What is the idea underlying the 5 pillars of Islam? The Shahada, the Salat, the Zakat, the Ramadan, the Hajj. Togetherness and sharing. The sharing of the zakat of so and so many percent given to the poor. Or the idea of not sitting down to eat unless you are sure that those in the houses around you have enough to eat, has made elimination of misery more feasible in Muslim than in Christian countries. In Christian countries, you may even have the suspicion that misery is needed for the Samaritan to save his soul. And you cannot save it unless you have miserable people around. And that alliance between Christianity and capitalism, with capitalism producing misery, and Samaritans producing their own salvation, has been a rather sad alliance. I see much of that in development assistance. The market system producing misery, and development assistance being the Samaritan. Talking about poverty reduction at the same time as poverty is being produced more than ever. A kind of schizoid pattern. The way Islam tries to get out of this is not through economic growth, but through sharing. But at the same time having trade as a sacrament, which is the reason why trade as a human relation takes a principal position in Islam. You will notice that when Muslims are praying, they are bowing down, they are on their knees, the face is touching the ground. At the same time, they are very close to it. There is submission, Islam, which also means peace, at the same time as there is togetherness. 5 times a day. The Protestant praying is more individual, more alone with God, if at all. And it is obvious that in this, the praying, which is called Salat, and the confession, the Shahada, you stimulate a spirituality which makes the network the major factor of development. And in this network, the great family, the clan, plays a major role. It is not horizontal. There may be a sheikh at the top of it, or even a sultan. When Napoleon conquered Egypt in 1798, he had made a title for himself, Sultan el-Kebir, the big sultan, the great sultan. He was not so terribly tall, so maybe he needed a very big title in order to make himself. He has a successor, le petit Napoleon Sarkozy, who is on the same track. Now he was driven out of Egypt by a successful resistance about 8 years later, let us say 1806. Interesting history. I'm not saying Islam is in any way a horizontal system, but a model, togetherness and sharing. This, of course, has its obvious, if you will, repercussion on the financial system. Let us say that the financial system is very similar to what we in the West have inside families. When you lend some money to your nephew, you don't charge interest. But at the same time, you have a little party together, and you sort of discreetly pass a little envelope with something. But the party is the major part. Maybe at the same time you watch, depending on your number of nephews or grandchildren, that you don't exhaust your own capital. Sharia has a rule of 30%. Don't lend more than 30%. Interesting. There was a limit in the United States up to 2004, 1,200%. A little bit higher. That limit was found too limiting. So the Bush administration abolished it, and the sky was the limit. So the Ponzi schemes, the Ponzi pyramids could reach the sky was the limit, and that's where it ended. I'm looking forward to the first conference between Wall Street and Islamic bankers. With the Wall Street bankers saying, teach us some tricks, please. How can you convince people of this? I'm not sure that conference will take place. As a matter of fact, I have a totally different image, and that sooner or later, one might think in terms of a military intervention to close Wall Street. Because to close down the New York Stock Exchange would be a major benefit to the world. Having said that, you will see now the economic factor dampened down to, I would say, more decent level. The human factor of a human relation before you enter a contract, which makes it very difficult even to buy a carpet, because you have to go through an infinity of cups of tea and exchanges of photos of your wives and things of that kind before you can buy that carpet. And I remember myself once in Marrakesh saying, I'm sorry, could we speed it up a little bit because my plane is leaving or something like that. And the guy said, next time. we can make it easy when you have better time. The human relation taking priority. It's a totally different unfolding concept. Economic growth doesn't make sense. Social growth would make sense. Human growth would make sense. That doesn't mean that I don't think Islam could have something to learn in terms of equity and equality. Western liberal model I've already talked about. And I would then try to say immediately what are the strong points in the Western liberal model. And of course it is democracy and human rights. Of course it is. But if democracy is such a good idea, why not practice it? Why not bring it to the UN, for instance? Veto power. Nothing to do with democracy. And if the veto powers don't like their veto power abolished, they can organize their own united veto powers and veto each other every day as much as they want. Pull out. Get going. Introduce democracy. China has a much more interesting democracy program today than the West has. But it does not include multi-party national elections. There they have another model which is Confucian. The idea that wisdom should be at the top. For which reason the party with 70 million members, as far as I know, has become very much a party of the educated and the university people. The Politburo meeting never ends without a lecture from a leading Chinese professor on some topic. So, what they mean by democracy, local municipal level, democracy in the community, democracy at the level of the enterprise, democracy inside the party, and democracy in the other 5 parties in China, and in the relationship between. What do they mean by democracy? They mean dialogue more than debate. They mean the situation in which everybody contributes idea. They have a slogan, they call it idea democracy as opposed to Western arithmetic democracy, where the figure 50% has a magic quality. Below 50, above 50. You can say that without necessarily taking a stand, I think arithmetic democracy has a certain charm. But so does idea democracy. And I'm equally amazed each time there is an election. And we are presented with empty poster with a face on it. And not even a, let us say, sentence that could be inspiring and have something original in it. Just a face. A cult of personality. A cult of faces. To learn. Maybe they could also learn other concepts. Maybe. Now, human rights. Of course we have something to contribute. But I think one has to stand very firmly on the position that there are 3 generations of human rights, and the third is highly under development. It's 12 December 48, 16 December 66, and the nascent 3rd generation. For the right to peace, the right to development, the right to a clean environment. Which all could be carried by Article 28 of the Declaration of Human Rights. Namely, the right of everybody to live in a social and world order where the realization of these rights is possible. Wait, what does that mean in terms of peace? It doesn't mean disarmament. It means ability to solve conflict. It means ability to enter into a conflict situation, having some idea how to handle it. The country that has the least quantity of that ability is the United States of America. When it encounters a difficulty, 243 times to be precise, the rule has been send the Marines. Right now the Marines plus a little extra. Under the Obama administration, which has now come out, not because of ideology, but because of a higher level of activity to the right of Bush, is fighting wars against 4 Muslim nations. The Palestinians, the Iraqis, the Pakistanis, and the Afghans. And threatening to bomb them into smithereens with the 5th one, Iran. Don't be surprised if some Muslims regard this as a war against Islam. Don't be surprised. Right, but that, of course, 57 Muslim countries. So there are still 52 to go. But Yemen and Somalia are very high on the list. And you will notice how this is being stepped up. There is no withdrawal from Iraq. Palestinians are left in an even more miserable situation under the Obama administration. He will probably, this is an informed guess, opt for escalation with 30,000 more, not 40. And that will come very soon. He may be discreet enough to wait after he has gotten the Nobel Peace Prize, which is a kind of self-therapy of some Norwegian elites. Now, this kind of thing is in the logic of the Paraguay experiment. I think what they're most afraid of is exactly an Islamic model of development. And here the Islamic model of development suffers from some of the same weakness as the Western liberalism. Pretended universalism. Of the 6 models I mentioned, the Western liberal, the Western Marxist, and the Islamic have universalism. There are 2 universalist religions, Christianity and Islam. Islam focusing more on desert countries, in a belt from Morocco to the Philippines. Christianity being in love with the temperate zone, and Buddhism having a proclivity for tropical forests. But this is breaking down under globalization. They are all moving around. They are all moving. In other words, we have problems here searching for a new mentality. And that mentality is not the monopoly position for any one of them, but mutual learning, give and take, and maybe some eclecticism. Having said this, let me say a word about the Western Marxist model. I will not identify the Western liberal model with Wall Street September 2008. Nor will I identify the Western Marxist model with the Soviet Union. I will say we have to learn from it. And it opens for insight in contradictions in the models. But there is more to it than that. Let us say that you start with a very simple model of the economy. You just buy that jazz that you have 3 basic factors. And the basic factors of production, let us just call them nature, human, and capital. Well, why did we select one of them to carry the burden of economic thinking? Capital. It's a long story. And a part of that story, where the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, from a Catholic country, finding a more hospitable country, namely Islam, Muslim Turkey, Ottoman Empire. And from there developing banking, giving loans to warring Christian countries, themselves in a certain street in the city of London. And when time came for a jump, jumped across the Atlantic, establishing themselves in Wall Street. Major one being Goldman Sachs, the key contributor to the Obama campaign, the major one. That Goldman Sachs got their reward in terms of a quite handy package of bailout money. Goes without saying, that's the nature of the presidential system. Having said that, why don't we have natureism and humanism on par with capitalism? What kind of economic science is that? That basically itself on only one factor. And I would then say that I find more humanism in Marxism than in liberalism. Much, much more. One might even say almost too little capitalism. Give capitalism its due. Learn from the Bible. Give to Caesar that of Caesar, and to God that of God. Give to nature that of nature, to humans that of humans, to capital that of capital. I'm not in favor of abolishing capitalism. I'm in favor of limiting it, domesticating it, taming it, keeping it under close supervision, and how naturism, meaning environmentalism, and humanism grow. For that reason, I find it so wonderful when Marx writes about the goal of the whole thing, economic activity. Das Reich der Notwendigkeit and das Reich der Freiheit. The realm of necessity, basic needs, have to be satisfied. And the realm of freedom, have to be satisfied. The human rights tradition in the West picks up the second and not the first, and blames China incessantly for being short on human rights. Well, China is short on civil and political human rights. They are doing miracles with the social and economic, not with the culture. The United States is very short on social and economic rights. The latest figure is that 1/6 of American citizens go hungry to bed. And the number of people starving is high. The number of Americans who experience hunger is the same as the average for the world. 1 out of a little more than 6 billion. 1 out of 6. The US is becoming an average country. Now, that's against human rights of the 16th December 1966 variety. So China can have a feast celebrating that and blaming the US for that. China has a different approach in that regard. They don't do much of that business, the blaming business. It comes, but in a kind of subtle way that maybe is not understood in the West. Of course we are in favor of those. I don't think anybody has a monopoly on the order in which they can be realized. I can see arguments for civil political first and for social economic first. I can see good arguments for being both. And I can see very good arguments for the Chinese pattern of development, which is 9 years of growth, 9 years of distribution, 9 years of growth, 9 years of distribution, 9 years of growth, a 4 years waiting period when Mao Zedong died and there was big confusion. 9 years of growth, 9 years of correction, 9 years of growth. We are now in 2007. My Japanese wife are in Beijing watching the 17th Party Congress, my 9 years prediction scheme. Makes me think we are in for big changes in taming capitalism. And up comes Hu Jintao with the 3 deficits. We have enormous inequalities. We have enormous problems, environmental, that we have caused by our phenomenal growth. And we have democracy deficit. 26 proposals about how to handle it. I haven't found one single Western media that was able to report it. They were talking about Hu Jintao's propaganda. When that country, with a 6,000 years old civilization, works on something and comes up with a decision, better take it seriously. Something is going to happen. To lift 400 million people out of misery into lower middle class from 1991 to 2004 is a major achievement in human history in that field. A major achievement. So I have said something, and I hope that there will be a Western Marxist model. that will realize, maybe particularly what the younger marks learned, and not what the epigones trying to pick up some economic points, instead of the intense humanism of the Marxist message. Now, having history with capital H as a god, I'm a little bit less sure about it. Little bit less. And there are good elements that are changed into a self-righteousness, and I'm deeply skeptical of a universalism. Finally, some words about the Japanese model. Enormously successful. And like the Chinese model, based on overcoming the contradiction between state and capital by working hand in hand. Overcoming the contradiction between management and workers by W-shaped dialogue. Initiatives from the management down to the workers for dialogue, being sent back in revised form, down to the workers for the second time, being sent back in revised form for final decision making. Overcoming. It's not unknown in the West, particularly in the Nordic social democracies. And the third point, overcoming the contradiction between labor-intensive and capital-intensive production by doing both. Extremely capital-intensive in the robotized assembly line phase. Extremely labor-intensive in the preparation for that. And labor-intensive in the checking of the final product. Outcompeting the US, whereupon the US took its revenge and demanded that they dismantle the model, which they did, and they took on the US model, which they did, and now have the highest debt of all countries in the world. Terrible failure. Up comes Hatoyama Yukio, the present Prime Minister, with 3 points. I'm not going to participate in US market fundamentalism. It's an interesting expression. Point 2, I'm in no way saying goodbye to the United States. We want to continue cooperation. But our orientation will be towards our neighbors in East Asia, China and Korea. It's difficult to say North Korea, so they often use the expression Korean Peninsula to cover that. Point 3, searching for an East Asian currency that has no dollars in it. The yen yuan, yuan yen. Personally, I have been arguing in the book here about the decline of the US empire in favor of a combination of yuan and rupee, which I call the UP, and hoping for that one. It doesn't really matter. There are 6 major efforts in the world now to have competing currencies, and the dollar is very quickly disappearing as a world currency. Now, the Japanese model is right now not the Japanese model, but the US model. What Hatoyama is wanting is back to the Japanese model. But what's the purpose of it? The purpose is not economic growth, but social harmony. That social harmony is both for Japan and China difficult to translate into world harmony, because the world partly doesn't exist. One of them, the Zhongguo, the kingdom in the middle, because they see themselves as surrounded by North barbarians, East barbarians, South barbarians, and West barbarians. It was terrible to be surrounded by so many barbarians. And had difficulties overcoming the complex of assets. And the other one, because it sees itself as the descendant of the sun goddess. They have to join the world. And you can say that the Western liberal, the Western markets, is overjoining the world by having the world accept them. Japan and China will have to accept the world as equal markets. Now, imagine now that you are a prime minister of a country, a poor country. and you are in the terrible process of development. I would learn from Buddhism the importance of a small, healthy community. And I know perfectly well that there are more models in the world than the 6 I have mentioned. I have mentioned them because I'm familiar with them. I would learn that from Buddhism, I would do everything to avoid social isolation. When 40% of Swedish households consist of one person, I know a crime has been committed. There is a lot of loneliness in Norway. It is not counted in the UNDP index. That loneliness detracts considerably. You can have loneliness with more than one person in the household. I will pick from Islam the sharing. I will pick from the Western liberal model maybe the Guarani Jesuit experiment. It's not recognized by the Western liberal model, but it is in Christian history. Collective property, private use. Sounds like a contradiction, it's not. It can work miracles. It was in Darfur, the pattern, until Khartoum nationalized it and called it traditional. Nationalized it because of oil. The result was the creation of an enormous nomadism, and the rest is history. I will pick from the Western Marxist model the intense humanism, the attention to basic needs. I will pick from the Chinese model the idea that maybe we cannot do everything at the same time. Maybe we concentrate 9 years on this and 9 years on that and 9 years on this. And we listen to the signals from the ground, the yin and the yang. Time for yin is up. Now it's time for yang. After some time we change again. Might be difficult to do both at the same time. If you can do it, so much the better. Might be difficult. I would pick from the Japanese model the ability to overcome Western important contradictions. Don't let the West tell you that there is a contradiction between plan and market and state and capital. They can go hand in hand. The Chinese do it masterly in the present formula. Let jungle capitalism have its say, and then we move in and take it. But keep that power. And if the West doesn't like it, that's the West problem. That's the West problem. Let them agonize about it. I would pick overcoming the contradiction between management and workers. And I will pick overcoming the contradiction between labor-intensive and capital-intensive. And I will have social harmony as a goal. In other words, I would be eclectic. I would practice the French saying, je prends mon bien où je le trouve. I take the good thing where I can find it and enjoy it. And doing so, and I've just indicated one formula, we would have enormous amount of diversity and symbiosis inside the countries, between the countries, in the world. And you would avoid the dangers of development monoculture. Thank you. I am a revolutionary in the sense of making a discourse change from imitating the Western model, the Western liberal, to benefiting from the whole world human experience. Inside that, I would be an incrementalist. And even more than that, I would tend to say, try it out at the local level. If you are a surgeon and you're experimenting with a new operation, start with one person, please. It's so good that you cannot operate 1 million at the same time, because you may be wrong. So I'm even a pragmatist, even an empiricist. incrementalist in time and in space. I'll give you one other example, which has to do with peace, since it is on your agenda. Saturday in Washington, last Saturday, not 2 days ago, but 9 days ago, I was in a place in Washington together with the Pentagon General. And we, that is my profession. I'm a mediator, a conflict mediator. And it was, of course, about Afghanistan. And you can say that my basic point was, you have to change your discourse. You have to change the way you talk about Afghanistan. And the US discourse, whether you are for or against, is cost-benefit analysis of war. Where those who are for say the benefit is victory and it's worth the costs. And those who are against say the victory is elusive and it's not worth the costs anyhow. And I think, instead of discussing that, try to find out which are the underlying conflicts and try to solve them. You simply switch. He and I embraced each other in the end, and the door opened by the third person who had organized the meeting and was very nervous about how it would end, and found us, the general and the non-general, embracing each other. So the reason I tell this story is the basic importance of the discourse you choose for handling, and there the word revolution may be needed.
Thank you. And then
what I say in this coming book called The Theory of Development is that I haven't found the Hindu model. Nehru came out with Harold Lasky from London School of Economics. It was Laskyology. And most of the people in this room are too young to know who was Harold Lasky. But he was a major left-wing Labourite. And it was welfare state. It was much of it. It was halfway communism, or three-quarter way. Nehru was fascinated with it. You see, Gandhi came out with a model which I have absorbed into the Buddhist model. And there's a famous saying by the Mahatma that maybe it's actually a Buddhist idea. And that did not tally well with Pune, right-wing Hindu, that we call it clergy, and God killed him. He was executed, I think, in great part for that kind of statement. The Hindu model is destroyed by the role of the Varna system, the caste system. And if you liberate the Hindu model from the Varna, you come so close to the Buddhist model that it's difficult for me to identify a Hindu model. What I find brilliant about India is something else. Absolutely brilliant. Linguistic federalism. That you've been able to do that, I think it's a fantastic achievement. That the Ori speaking can speak Ori in their own Orissa, to put it that way. You have many of them. And when that problem was solved, you got rid of a lot of friction and upshot economic growth. But the model you have is the Western literature. You have nothing new. You have contributed, in my mind, absolutely nothing. For which reason I don't identify the Hindu model. I wish there were one. But I think the good thing is the Buddhist aspect of it. So, about this, I'm sure you and I could have many details to say. Many details. And don't think that I think Buddhism is impeccable. You see, Buddhism has a tendency to be so tolerant that it allies itself with the state. And out came the Buddhist role in militarist Japan, in Sri Lanka, and in Thailand. Not at all. So I have a kind of more sort of clean, purified Buddhism concept, which comes very close to the oceanic circles of the Gandhi villages. only have to say as the last point that I find one Gandhi village a little bit too similar to the next one. So I can use the saying that you have about the Midwest America. If you have seen one of them, you've seen them all. I want more variety, please. Thank you. Thanks indeed. I have not been able to identify one African model. And I think it's an insult to Africa to talk about one African model. But your question is extremely well taken. We have fault lines in the human construction. Between humans and nature, between the genders, the generations, the races. Don't tell me that people do not have different color of their skin. I'm not colorblind. I know perfectly well that it's correlated in reality with practically speaking nothing. But it's so damn visible. With class, defined as power versus the powerless, around economic, military, political, cultural dimensions. Nation, territory. And all of that you have crisscrossing each other in terrible ways, and sometimes exploding. Sometimes structural violence, sometimes terrible sparks or direct violence. And on top of that, the fault line between Africa and the old and new colonizers. You can see the Sudan as a crystallization point. I find the Congo even worse. Then I also hold up what to me are positive experiences. Cameroon, Gabon, Senegal. I mean, with both all of them you can add some footnotes. But the media will only concentrate on the failures. And then enters the concept of social harmony. I myself have three different approaches to the concept. One is equity, equal exchange. Gender parity then becomes a major factor. The other one, which is not mine, is the Confucian one, which is stratified according to gender, generation, and education, with older educated males on top. The most Confucian country in the world is North Korea. And I can tell you, to be an older male with education is quite nice in one sense, in that country. In one sense. It's not my way of thinking, but it exists. And the idea being then rights and duties with a minimum guaranteed in a hierarchy that is well institutionalized. China is trying to do something like that in the construction of the party. The party is communist only in name. I think it's basically Confucian. But it starts with CO, Communist Confucian, so it's a little bit the same thing. Now, the third concept, which is the one that I find most fascinating, is of course equity-based, but then based on ability to overcome conflict. So that whenever there is a contradiction, and there is exploitation, and there is penetration, fragmentation, exclusion, all of that people know what to do. And since the world is dialectic, wherever you have a solution, there will be a new yin-yang coming up. And when you have handled that one, the history is like a postal clerk in Princeton. There was once a professor who had a sort of sonorous voice when people were lining up. He said, "Next!" History is saying, "Next!" We better learn how to handle it. In other words, handling of conflict without renting a gun and without an improvised explosive device for information that costs $10. A little bit to the despair of the Pentagon, because they're not good at weapons that cost $10. The unit is 10 billion. So, and they're very effective. I'm recommending conflict resolution. So this is an effort to attend to your beautifully formulated principles. Thank you. Now, lecturing, listening to me forever brings in my agony about the Christian paradise. Forever is a long period, maybe. You might get tired in the end.